Good afternoon. My name is Holly Joseph and I am the Director of the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism at the University of Reading, and I am delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's talk. I'm sure many of you have attended previous CeLM events and already know something about what we do and who we are, but for those of you who are not familiar with CeLM, I just want to say a few words about us. So our mission is to work within the field of literacy and multilingualism, to conduct research, engage with practitioners and the general public, and to train the next generation of researchers. And our research spans 5 interconnected themes: language and literacy, migration, health, education, and neuroscience. And tonight's talk, or today's talk, crosses, I guess, the theme of language and literacy and education. So today you'll hear from 3 speakers, and I'll pass over to Anna in a moment to introduce them. But just before I do, just a few words about how this webinar is going to work. So because it's a webinar, your microphones are muted and your cameras are off, but we do want to encourage questions and discussion. So please feel free to post throughout the talk. If you have a question for our panel, please make sure you post this in the Q&A section, not in the chat. But if you wish to comment or ask questions more informally to other attendees, then feel free to do so in the chat section. So we won't address questions in the chat to our speakers, but we will address questions in the Q&A session to our speakers. Please note that tonight's event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel within the next few days. So without further ado, I would like to pass over to Dr. Anna Tsakalaki, one of our education theme leads at CeLM, and she will introduce today's event and speakers. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Holly. I'm Anna Tsakalaki. I co-lead the theme of language and literacy together with Wright and as Holly was saying, our mission is to promote research that is related to language and literacy. And today we have an overlap with education. And we're going to speak about international students in higher education. We're thrilled that many of you are here to discuss this topic. A little bit on my background. I'm a lecturer in education at the Institute of Education of the University of Reading. Before that, I started in 2016 as a PhD student here at Reading. And then I worked for Oxford Brookes University and the University of Winchester. And my research interests are around literacy skills, literacy difficulties in different languages, and how language is taught, how vocabulary is taught, and multilingualism. I will now pass on the stage to Clare, Wright, and Maylene, who will introduce themselves as well, before we start our presentation. Clare, over to you.
Thanks very much, Anna, and thank you, Holly. And can I just say how very nice it is to be back as part of the CeLM network. I joined Reading in 2010 in the early days of CeLM, and although I'm now an associate professor of linguistics and language teaching at Leeds, I had some very, very happy days and at Reading, and I still remember many of my colleagues there with great pleasure. The work that I do focuses mainly on how to make sure that multilingual communication can be as effective as possible from the learning point of view and from the teaching point of view. This research that we'll discuss today came out of a conversation I had with May many, many years ago when I started off my PhD and early teaching at Newcastle, where we were aware of students who may be quite good in some aspects of their academic English and not others. And so really a lot of my PhD and subsequent research has been trying to unpack that question of what it means to be a successful multilingual language user. May, do you want to introduce yourself now?
Yeah. Thank you, Claire. And thank you for reminding me all those enjoyable conversation. So my name is Maylene. I'm a senior lecturer at School of Education, Communication and Language Sciences at Newcastle University. My research is interested in teacher pedagogy and teacher development. In particular, I'm interested in how teachers help learners through the learning process. And I am involved in a number of national, international research projects regarding integrated teaching thinking into the curriculum. And I have supervised the PhD students from Taiwan, Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and Thailand and Vietnam, and mainly look at the process in the classroom, and also a few studies on how to integrate critical thinking into the foreign language classroom. So mainly I've been working with international students in the last probably 15 years. Yes, so really pleased to be here to share our research with you.
So thanks very much, May, and thanks, Anna. And I was very, very lucky to come across both May and Anna in my journey through these questions that were taking over a lot of my thinking time to try and work out how quickly and how efficiently some kind of teaching intervention may be able to, or some kind of teaching experience may be able to help students improve their academic interactional strategies. By that, I mean the kind of experience of dealing with seminars, with questions, with that kind of interaction and communication that's needed in a typical postgraduate higher education setting.
Thank you, Claire. Shall we now start?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
So this research has recently come out in our journal article for the Journal of English for Academic Purposes, and you can see the reference there. And we do encourage you, we hope, after this talk to take a look at our paper. So briefly today, we're going to start off with a short review of some of the issues that we believe face students in acquiring academic interactional competence, and we'll define what we mean by that. And we'll go on to saying how we focused on the use of listening and speaking strategies, not just from the EAP perspective, but trying to understand how these sorts of strategies revealed the value of a more holistic approach to second language acquisition, and how some of our understanding of the way listening and speaking processes are going on in the learner's mind, how they can be aided perhaps by even short-term EAP courses. Many of you may have experience yourself of either being on a pre-sessional or teaching on a pre-sessional, and so what kind of situation does that provide for students to try and build up these greater abilities to engage in listening and speaking? And although we're going to present our research study within the perspective of a fairly standard take on the use of listening and speaking strategies, we're going to take you on to what we talk about in our paper, where what we see as the more usual approaches to listening and speaking needs a little bit of tweaking in our view, and how the concept of student stance, something coming out of psychological research, may be useful for EAP teachers and EAP learners in terms of boosting a broader interactional disposition to be ready to take part in that kind of interaction in a seminar setting. So what we really were focusing on, students who feel that at the beginning of their time as typical international postgraduate students, feeling rather zipped up and unable to communicate, to being happy interactive chatterers by the end. So what do we mean by academic interactional competence? Well, those of you who are familiar with the work on communicative competence, communicative language teaching, may well have an idea of how trying to engage not just in using what you know, but using what you know in the appropriate genre and discourse settings can be quite tricky to develop. And in later work as well, particularly with colleagues at Newcastle, looking at how people interact and understanding the more complex realities of what it is to turn take, to engage in dialogue, and to listen effectively, and to use the listening in order to speak effectively, how all that gets packaged up together. And people may be familiar with some of the pedagogic research on communicative language teaching and in more recent years, task-based language teaching, in which the task itself, the kind of situation in which two people may have to listen and speak to each other, may be constrained by the demands of the task condition at the time. From an SLA point of view, and this is really where my background has been most focused, and also particularly Anna's, what are the psycholinguistic constraints that go on when we are processing the flow of speech, both in listening and in producing it in real time? And you may have come across this notion of top-down versus bottom-up processing, that top-down might be more aimed at the whole meaning, gist of a communication, and there are moments in a fluent speaker, of course, they are able to do that while also being able to handle the demands of bottom-up processing. So making sure that the individual formation of each word or string or utterance turn is followed appropriately or is understood accurately. So we were keen to try and link this pedagogic and psycholinguistic, these domains together. And from my experience as an EAP teacher in many years in Western settings, that notion of how to help our students become more confident and more engaged in that kind of dialectical interaction, the notion of peer questioning of each other, let alone responding to questions from a teacher or a module, a tutor at the front. Of course, that's also connected. Well, in my work, I believe that's connected to this idea of developing critical thinking, where this sort of curiosity and interest in probing deeper is encouraged, particularly at master's level. And we see this coming out in seminars, in questions. So as well as more broad engagement through the higher educational experience, just being able to take part in conversations effectively is something that we think is of value, not just academically, but more broadly. Just to also mention that this sort of interest in how do people listen and speak in interactive ways effectively, of course, this also links to pedagogies of active learning, the idea that people can develop strategies for themselves where they seek to become more effective at something, to develop self-efficacy, to shape their learning, and to use that idea of proactivity to take the engagement in the academic experience beyond just simply delivering on something like an assessment that would meet the narrow demands of an academic performance, but really help drive the overall attitude to engagement with learning. I'm sure that most of you will have some familiarity with the range of research that's done in this rather interdisciplinary approach that we were working with, but some of the factors underlying effective communication, of course, may rely on the amount of linguistic knowledge you have, the lexis and grammatical structural knowledge that you may need, but particularly with fluency and particularly with interaction, some more focus on what the processes are to develop a more fluent or more automatized way of using that knowledge is important. Work by Tsakalaki might be familiar to some of you on how the processes of speaking can develop over time and with practice, but certainly can be affected by different tasks or different contexts. And the idea of moving to a study abroad environment where the student typically is immersed in that target language, then the theory goes that should help fluency and automaticity to develop. But alongside that, we know from work by John Field, of course, who also has Reading connections, and Suzanne Graham and other colleagues at Reading and elsewhere, the idea that people are developing specific skills for boosting listening or for speaking is not quite as straightforward as we might think, and a degree of greater understanding and clarity of what is really going on when people are listening and people are speaking seem to be important for us. From my own background, I've worked with the notion that people might have certain individual cognitive constraints, for example, from working memory, that might encourage some people with greater working memory to find interaction easier to handle just by dint of juggling all the demands that are required in a conversation, whereas other people with lower working memory capacity might find interaction just cognitively very demanding and struggle with it a bit more. So that's from the sort of SLA skill development cognitive side of our interests, but there are these other broader aspects of how language learning and particularly EAP type teaching and learning can be affected by what we know about communication strategies what works for keeping the flow of the conversation going, how people want to try and maybe align with each other and find things in common with each other, or might find it quite difficult and feel rather distanced from each other, or may lack suitable strategies for any gaps that they have in handling the knowledge required for a particular activity. As well as communication strategy research, there's also the extensive work done, of course, on general language and learning strategies, as well as the more attitudinal work done on motivational and socio-affective factors, and particularly the work done by McIntyre and others on the willingness to communicate. This was an area of work that we felt aligned with our interests very well, but we needed to sort of pull these threads together. So you can see that when we were trying to complete the literature review for our journal article, we were covering quite a lot of ground, and all of these elements are important. But from our point of view, we were really interested in seeing how they all came together. And I was delighted when I came across a paper by Nakatani done on L2 English in Japan high school settings, which seemed to do pretty much this kind of approach, which is thinking about the L2 processes involved in boosting effective communicative interaction in communicative classrooms. And Nakatani did a very interesting two-stage set of work by exploring student strategies which they articulated themselves as strategies they felt they used or found difficult to do when they were focusing either on trying to express their meaning more, keep going with fluency more, versus perhaps times when they might be focused very much on item by item accuracy of particular words, or getting a bit bogged down in coming up with constructing an utterance in a more bottom-up way. Now, what Nakatani did, and we don't have time to go into this, but he developed a set of strategies where students rated themselves on how much they used various ones, and he coded some of these as being more meaning focused and others as more accuracy focused, and he found that those students who scored higher on the meaning focused strategies indeed correlated with higher marks in their oral interaction. So great, top-down meaning focused strategies makes your interaction better. That was the idea. So that prompted our interest, and trying to see exactly what he meant by this sort of processing versus form-focused strategies. This is just the groupings that Nakatani used in his work, which we adapted and used in ours. So when we say people might score themselves fairly highly on meaning-oriented strategies, that might be activities or strategies or the ability to try and maintain fluency, keep going, try and negotiate for meaning, being flexible about how you say something, being able to adapt a message in terms of speaking, and then in terms of listening, the idea of aiming for gist, trying to pick up the overall meaning, but also broader factors such as trying to think in English, rather than the L1 before speaking, and also issues about confidence in taking part, being part of a group, trying to encourage others to take part in the general interaction. By contrast, there could be strategies that seem to be more focusing on accuracy, relying on familiar words, using what you know rather than taking that risk to go a bit further, but also the rather sad self-awareness of maybe stopping speaking if you think your listener could not understand you, and not really being able to adapt your message to suit the interaction. Also, people were very much aware that they might be listening for specific words, like the first word of a sentence or so on, or scan listening, for example, to try and pick up the verb rather than really trying to grasp the meaning. And there were also the acknowledgement of not really working in the L2, but more like thinking in the L1. So these were our overall themes that we were looking for, and we adapted the questionnaire that was used by Nakatani to create our own. And then we wanted to see, well, okay, if we can analyze students who may be using these strategies, how quickly might they be able to see a shift from perhaps a reliance on more bottom-up form-focused strategies to what we were presuming would be more effective strategies for them, and would a 5-week EAP course be enough for this? We also had the secondary question to see if indeed any shift in language strategies might even impact on their exit language scores, Although, to be honest, the way an typical EAP course is structured, it was probably not exactly the same kind of oral interaction tasks that Nakatani used, but we wanted to see what would happen. And, you know, working on the hypothesis that those who scored more highly on the strategies relating to more top-down, just meaning-focused strategies would end up revealing, you know, a perhaps greater confidence in communicative competence that would stand them in good stead for then going out there and dealing with their academic seminar demands. We wanted to see if there are any clear trends, even at time 1, but also at time 2. For example, might listening strategies be rated higher than speaking strategies? Would we indeed see that shift from bottom up to top down as we were predicting? So that's what we were looking for. And in terms of how we did this, we were able to work with an entire pre-sessional cohort. And I need to be very, very grateful to my Newcastle colleagues for helping fix this. We had I think originally 430 signed up at time 1, but then we wanted the same person again at time 2. So out of the whole groupings, we had a final group of 230 participants who took the same questionnaire at time 1 and time 2. These were from a range of mixed L1s, although majority were Chinese, and they were all coming into this pre-sessional at IELTS 6 as an overall score. They were measured at time 1 in their first week of turning up into the pre-sessional, and at time 2 within the last week. Now, depending on when the teachers could schedule this, it varied slightly, but there was approximately 4 weeks of difference in terms of their experience of being on the course and living in Newcastle as it was at the time. The item was a 48-item questionnaire. Each item had a scale of 1 to 10, and they were just given the paper very simply, the questionnaire very simply in paper form, and just asked to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 10. These questionnaire items, as I say, were balanced between being top-down, meaning-focused, or form-focused, bottom-up, and balanced between the across 6 listening strategies and 6 speaking strategies, with 2 to 3 items per theme, as it were. We had version A and B to avoid order effects, so whichever they had at time 1, they got the other one at time 2. So all of this quite extensive quantitative data we hoped would be sufficient to validate our assumptions around the idea that meaning versus form-based strategies was somehow similar to the idea of top-down, bottom-up processing, which would then lead on to their performance in the exit scores in the way they were displaying abilities to do listening and speaking in the interactive parts of that final test. So I think just to check, Anna, I'm going to do the next couple of slides, and then you're going to take over where we move on to the where we found that our strategy approach wasn't quite working. So just briefly to present then some descriptives on the overall of what we found. You can see here that at time 1 and at time 2, they were pretty equal in terms of how they rated themselves in their use of listening strategies. It crept up very slightly by time 2, and by in speaking as well. What was interesting was that the difference between listening and speaking was actually significant, and this is partly, I think, the benefit of our big group. So although the differences don't look descriptively that high, we could see that the overall ratings were significantly higher on the listening strategies at both times. The difference between time 1 and time 2 was also but less with the less power significant by time 2. So were they using listening and speaking strategies? Yes, on the whole they were, and yes, listening strategies seem to be higher than speaking. The use of listening strategies seemed to be higher than speaking strategies, but that did improve by time 2. Now, in terms of breaking it down by meaning focused versus form focused, again we can see a slight difference in that the meaning focused was less used at time 1, but slightly against what we predicted, it also remained less than form focused at time 2. And again, that is significantly different. However, there's nothing really going on in terms of the difference over time. So they stay pretty, they stay more connected to their form focused strategies even by time 2. So I think that's on the listening, sorry. And then on the speaking, we can see a bigger difference at both times, but we also still see this reliance on form-focused strategies, particularly clear in comparison to the meaning focused strategies. So these differences both between meaning and form are significantly different at both times, and the difference between time 1 and time 2, any shift, any improvement, well, any shift is significant by time 2. But there wasn't really that large move towards a higher focus on meaning focused strategies. That was less clear in the speaking items. Just because this took me a long while to do, it may seem quite busy, but it just gives you a visual sense of how the individual listening and speaking strategies work. So going from left to right, we see on the left that they're all the listening strategies, and the first 3 are the top-down ones. Then the 3 to 6 that in the middle are the bottom-up ones. On the right-hand side of the slide, these are the speaking strategies. Again, on the left, it's the more meaning-focused strategies, and on the right is the bottom-up focus strategies. So you can see that even within the different elements of speaking and listening, or of meaning versus form, there was a range of a variety of means. Some of them were rated really quite highly at both times, but you can see from the stars where the difference occurs between time 1 and time 2. So some of the fluency maintaining strategies, for example, LFM coded here, this improved significantly over time. So that shows that generally the differences on listening were more clearly significant over time. The other one that was significant is the one that's coded on the right-hand side, the socio-affective ones. This was covered a range of items, but it did also include the item about trying to be more confident in speaking. So it was nice to see that improve over time. But as you can see, a rather mixed picture, and not linking into our presuppositions. So given that we couldn't see, we saw some changes, that 5 weeks was enough, particularly in the listening, and we did see some overall increase, particularly in use of listening, more gist-wise, more fluency-wise, in the listening strategies. That was good to see. But we didn't see this connection as we expected between the strategy use. And then when we added in our analyses into the IELTS score, the exit scores that they were measured on as they finished the program, we couldn't see any connection between the strategy use patterns and those language scores. The things that best predicted how they did at the end of their pre-sessional was how well they did as they began their pre-sessional. The entry scores they had, and particularly their IELTS scores, that seemed to be that had the only statistical connection. So it made us think that perhaps listening and speaking skills at this typical kind of level of people you usually have not had much immersion experience is very much limited to listening and speaking in certain types of task, practicing these skills for certain types of purposes, and rather than see how to adapt listening and speaking for more general fluency purposes, more meaning focused purposes, and being rather stuck on perhaps more speaking for performance or listening for specific items in a more form focused way. But overall, what this left us being was puzzled. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Claire. So yes, as Claire was explaining, we couldn't see, when looking at the different subgroups, we couldn't see a very concise explanation of why the students were answering like that, why they felt they were not improving in the areas that we would hypothesize that they would improve given the course. So we decided to run a different type of analysis, a factor analysis. We used a PCA, so that, and that's why we put the picture of the prism over here. for those of you that are not familiar with this type of analysis, this kind of gives us the weighing of the different strategies. And instead of looking at 23 different items or subgroups of 4 or 5 different items, it then unites the items into a larger factor, a more a higher scoring factor, which researchers could perhaps find more easy to understand, interpret in terms of what those students' strategy use looked like at time 1 and time 2. So when having done this analysis for listening strategy use and speaking strategy use at time 1 and time 2, we looked at let's say a more qualitative way of interpreting the results, to see if there's any shift in the way they use their listening skills and their speaking skills over time. And we found that there were 6 or 7 stronger factors that revealed a shift in their stance. And also, apart from the form-focused, meaning-focused way of listening or speaking, we looked at what the factors were saying to us in terms of strategy use, and we identified patterns of orientating more towards the self. So in a way, perceiving themselves as more safe speaker that wouldn't take the risk, would look for accuracy more than interaction, versus a more other orientated speaker or listener that would be more focused on understanding what the other person's intention is when speaking to them, or focusing on what the message they want to pass on the other person is when speaking. So we found that these 6-7 stronger factors explained approximately 50% of the variability in strategy use at both times, which still leaves a lot of variability unexplained, another 50% unexplained, but at least these 50% strategy use of highest scoring factors is giving us a more concise picture of what these students seem to be doing at time 1 and time 2. Claire, if you could flick over the next slide, please. Thank you. So if we look at the listening strategy used in time 1, the highest scoring factors are, as you see in the first bit, 1 and 2 are to do with meaning-focused strategies, like negotiation for meaning or guessing the context of what the speaker wants to say. But then we see that in factor 3 and 4, form-focused strategies are included, such as translating what the other person is saying in English in their native language to be able to understand it, or focusing on single words, like the first word of the person's discourse, what they're saying. And then in factor 5, we can see some focus on clarity, on the clarity of message. So trying to understand, to disentangle what the other person is saying, but also looking for accuracy in what the other person is saying. And then in factor 6, we see a mixture of form-focused and meaning-focused strategies, so not yet clear what strategy they want to use. And lastly, number 7, passive listening, which is more like, even if I don't understand what the other person is saying, I will just sit there and listen without asking any questions for clarifications, which means that they're kind of what we're saying, the more safe listener. In time 2, the analysis showed that some of the other oriented strategies and the strategies that are mainly focused on the meaning of what the other person wants to pass on to the student as a listener, were more highly scored by the students, which gives us a kind of a picture of a qualitative difference now. So as you see in time 2, the higher scoring strategies are more to do with what is the intention of the person. Let's keep the dialogue going. And then let's try and focus on what the message that they want to pass on is, rather than how accurate the use of English is. And also negotiation for meaning, such as perhaps thinking of other words that could be used instead of the ones that the person is using to understand the meaning. But still, you will see that in factors 4, 5, and 6, where they still use self-oriented strategies, so the more safe speaker stance, form-focused strategies, so is the other person speaking proper English, like using the right grammar and things like that. And you will see in factor 6 that they are still maintaining the conversation, but they're not asking any questions if they're not if they don't understand. However, we see this shift from time 1, where the strategies are mixed in their use, to time 2, where there's a clear distinction of the meaning-focused, other-oriented strategies in the first 3 highly scoring listening strategies. Can we see? Yes, here we've got some examples of what an other-oriented strategy may look like. For example, I pay attention to words which my classmates emphasize in their speaking. So I try to understand what their intention is. And I aim to work out what my classmates mean, even if they hesitate a lot. So I don't focus a lot on their fluency of speaking, but I give them space to keep speaking to me, so that I enable this interaction between them and me. Let's go to the next one, Claire. This is the speaking strategy used, where we don't see as clear a shift as with listening, perhaps as one would hypothesize, given the analysis that we did before the PCA. And if we want to look at this in more detail, in T1, we clearly see the strategies that are more highly scored are the ones that are to do with accuracy. So how well do I use the language? Do I use the right vocabulary? Do I use the right grammar? If I don't use the right vocabulary, then I'd rather not speak. Factor number 2 was a mixture of self and other oriented strategies. So again, there's no clear stance in T1 as to who am I focusing on. Do I want to protect myself as a speaker of English, or do I want to focus on what I want to say to the other, what the message that the other that I want to pass on is more important. Number 3 is relying on L1, perhaps by writing down what they wanted to say first in their own language, in their first language, and then translating into English. And then you can see in factor 4 that there's a clear focus on other oriented strategies, but again, from the 6 factors, it's towards the bottom, so they're not as highly scored as the other ones. And 5 and 6 are to do with being hesitant as a speaker. So, for example, I would rather not speak at all if I don't know the exact vocabulary that I should be using in English. And if we look at time 2, the PCA showed clearly, sorry, that's my daughter, showed clearly students scoring higher their other oriented strategies. So they were trying to be more focused on the message and the other person, maintaining the communication. But then you will see in factor 2 and factors 3 to 6 that there's again a mixture of different strategies, both self-oriented and other-oriented, and between 3 and 6, form-focused and self-oriented. So again, there's this picture of somebody who's not yet clear as to how to be an efficient interactionist. So someone that knows the value of communicating, being interactive, and having this confidence to keep going regardless of the accuracy of what they're saying and the use of grammar. Claire, could you go to the next one? Okay, so this is you now then.
Thank you. So back to me. So thanks very much, Anna. And it was really interesting using that PCA analysis to give us this different take away from the binary top down, bottom up, and see a more nuanced approach to what was going on. But what it did, I think, emphasize is helping us understand what goes on, particularly for speaking, in terms of managing the challenge of speaking more creatively or more interactively. We see students focusing on what I've been calling performative competence, knowing how to do an activity well, as long as it was them producing it. What effect it had on their listener, that wasn't their business. And this links to what Tsakalaki talks about, where there's sort of almost like recitation speech, or as a closed skill, where people are really trying to focus down on what it is they know well, rather than be creative and step out of their comfort zone. So I think what we're seeing here is that within 5 weeks, we are seeing some evidence of students being given the opportunity in what we know are very well-run and very carefully planned EAP sessions to build these kinds of seminar skills, but they take a while. They take a while to develop, and the overlap between what we've perhaps more traditionally thought of as efficient language use strategies may go more deep, and maybe more to do with this stance, this orientation. Faulkner has this idea of sharing stance. So is the activity you're doing something which you both feel you've got an interest? Wang et al. Talks about the idea of operating in an activity with a sense of connectedness versus a sense of self-construal. So is this task about constructing myself? Is this task about performing for myself? Or is this task about ensuring I connect? So I think thinking about what students are doing, thinking about the advice which EAP teachers can give them, thinking about what is realistic for learners to experience both in and out of the classroom, requires, I think, everybody to, or we encourage people to have a slightly different shift in what might have been the typical advice of listen for the meaning, aim for the meaning, just get your message across. Sometimes even what we've been trying to advise in terms of maintaining fluency ended up more just, again, being part of your performance rather than about making sure that interaction happens. Paying attention to taking your time to express yourself, trying to use a good range of vocabulary, even using fillers while you're trying to hold your turn. Again, that's about you and your speaking turn, not about the interaction. So this sort of finishes up with the idea of speaking as a performance, speaking as a transmission of message. Seedhouse, another colleague of ours at Newcastle, talks about this idea of the transmission view of conversation, very transactional or transactive sense, where speaking, listening almost doesn't happen, and speaking is just, have I got the action over that I need to do? And possibly prior experience of the way they've had instruction, even training in, for example, speaking for IELTS exams, or taking classes for developing speaking skills or developing listening and so on, might keep this idea of focus on what are you doing in that activity, and can you transmit what it is that you need, rather than are you engaging more creatively in the interaction there and then. What we were happy to do was, both with our initial sense of the binary division in the strategies, but more interestingly through the PCA, we were able to claim that in our 5-week course, so 4 weeks of measurement, 5 weeks of experience, this could foster these gains, particularly in listening. That was really clear. The statistical gains were clear in listening. And because of the way we reframed the PCA, we think some of these listening gains were probably done almost implicitly, incidentally, just by taking part in that EAP set of classes and being there in the target language country. So that's good to know. That's good to know that in a short EAP course, listening really can change significantly and can develop that more self-oriented, a more other-oriented stance. But moving away from that sense of speaking as performance, that may take longer and may need more explicit encouragement. So we've made our questionnaire items publicly available, and we would really encourage people to replicate the study, and we would be very, very interested to know what you find. So really just to wrap up then some of what I've been saying already, good to know that things can change in as little as 4 to 5 weeks. Just to re-emphasize the value of confidence and having a go, taking a risk. If you're going to be measured in a particular speaking or listening activity, then how you want to take part in that activity seems to have a very clear effect. So willingness to communicate, definitely in there somewhere. We did see some lower scores on some strategies, coming down over time. Some of that sense of confidence in some of them was reducing, and we wondered whether a more sort of real world understanding of just the pressures of what it takes to interact in the target language environment, they're now coming across the requirement to interact for real. And that's probably a lot more challenging than the typical role plays they may have had in previous instructional exposure. And just the other orientation itself as a psychological stance is probably more demanding. We would definitely see some real functional value in explicitly presenting and discussing and encouraging students to be aware of these different strategies, the value of highlighting more risk-taking. We would encourage these to be embedded in specific practices, and this is something I'm now doing in all of my M-level work, in having tasks in as much as I can where they actually have to focus on what the other person's saying, and really practicing that other orientation as part of their overall fluency in speaking, not just being stuck on performing well. And overall, what we hope we're contributing to is wider research in understanding what speaking processes are and the connection between listening and speaking, how strategies do play a role. We do think that strategies are part of what makes for effective communicative teaching or task-based teaching approaches, but that some of the ways strategic knowledge and strategic practice has been researched so far perhaps needs to be reframed somewhat. And as always, more research is needed to see how useful these different ways of modelling these strategy uses are. And it's still very tempting to stick with that sense of top-down, bottom-up being a good way to explain what a lot of practices are. Could we start to shift that towards other-oriented or shared stance processing in the broader sense, not just in EAP strategies? But that's what we hope you've learned from our work today. We'd certainly be very happy to chat with you and answer any questions you may have. Please do also read the article. Yeah, we'd very much like to discuss what your response is to what you've been listening to, because we are very other oriented and we would very much like to know what you've been listening to. So just finally to thank everyone who took part, particularly all the staff at the Newcastle Into pre-sessional cohorts, and my lovely colleagues with me today, Anna and May. Thank you all.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, May. Do we have any questions?
Shall I stop sharing the screen and then
yeah. Then we can sort of see each other more easily. I have a very naive question to start us off. Is it rare to find a student who's, who's very good at listening but very bad at speaking, or very good at speaking and very, I mean, do those things, do you tend to go together, or is there?
Yeah,
that's sort of almost the point that you're sort of making.
Yes, in that you can learn to perform very well as a speaker and absolutely never listen at all. So taking part in a dialogue, as long as you're following a fairly clear script, you may not have paid attention to what your interlocutor is saying at all. And we do have people who seem to score well, typically on an IELTS with high listening, and are really struggling to put that into practice. And it may be that the previous experience of how to develop listening has not been aligned with this more natural, more interactive type of engagement. So it's just not being connected.
I mean, would it be the case at a very basic level of a very sort of early level of learning, you would have to listen? I mean, you know, I always think about, you know, first language acquisition. So obviously, you know, if you prevent a baby from listening, or a baby is deaf or something, of course they're not going to learn to speak, right? Because they have no input. So that's an extreme level. But I mean, isn't there, or is it really, when you're talking about more sophisticated sort of high level listening strategies, that's when you can get this kind of disconnect between speaking and listening skills?
Yes, I mean, May, I think this is very much something that you and your students have been working on, the idea of how you can end up producing sort of thoughtful and engaged and complex thinking in speaking, where, as far as we could tell, they were listening and we assumed comprehending. I think this is the other thing. You can listen and not to comprehend. So, you know, I think, you know, it was really, really useful to come across this idea of speaker stance. Also, I think, May, you've been identifying work on disposition, and you know, we can go right back to motivation and you know, the words that have been around for a long time. But we found this idea of disposition. We agreed, we quite liked this to capture some of what we're thinking about here. You have a willing disposition to take part in something, or you don't. And if you don't, you can become very skilled at certain disconnected aspects, but you're never going to really feel you're taking part. And to be frank, we can see this in home students too. It's just within a second language learning environment, there's been a lot of emphasis: develop your speaking skills by learning to recite a story very, very accurately. That doesn't make you able to take part in a conversation.
I think that is the exact truth. So that is willingness to communicate. So there's a lot of research on that. You can be very good at speaking, but interaction is complete another kind of issue. So what I'm doing now is really coming back to the share stance, and I do a lot of thinking skill activities. So that do require people to listen in order to respond to what's said before. So I'm thinking that is something I'm really interested to see how they develop. So I'm just thinking perhaps I should give them the questionnaire we did to see when after this, you know, have you developed your listener speaking? Do they need to respond to that? And what we found was they don't listen. Because the working memory, they're so focused on what they're going to say, and they completely ignore what is happening. So what I found with the students' discussion, there's no flow. There always new ideas came up because they didn't listen. So they just all new ideas. So you can see all the ideas presented are disconnected. So what I'm trying to do with them is how the argumentation discussion can flow. So that's really about the listening and speaking.
It sounds a bit like a politician on Question Time, doesn't it? Like speaking, let's talk about things that have no relevance whatsoever to what's just been asked.
I think certainly from you know, what you'll know this from first language, and again also Anna from her work with you know, children with impairment and other psycholinguistic cognitive models of language learning, and as May mentioned just now, I think the understanding from an EAP teacher and an EAP learner point of view, just what a flood is coming at you the whole time. That if you are trying to develop this curiosity and confidence in interaction, scaffold it.
Yeah.
Make it worthwhile to make the effort. And certainly start to construct it in ways in which it is approachable to do. So the maze activities, I mean, I've seen her do these, where it's almost like passing a mental ball around. And it can be an incredibly simple story. Wasn't one of it Humpty Dumpty? I forget now, but it was something where the point is to keep the ball being the ball being passed around the ring without being dropped. Much less on the complexity of the accuracy of the vocabulary. Now, there comes a point, obviously, at high level academic work where you're expected to be operating like the natives, like the home students, and then the academic teachers, once on the courses, may give no room for this listening and speaking load that occurs. So, this is where the EAP scaffolding, the EAP bridge into the world needs to be realistic and needs to give the students a little taste of just how demanding it could be. But my goodness, it could also give them these strategies to say, well, if you do more of this, it could help. But I would also say that I think it's incumbent on a lot of staff members, a lot of academic staff teachers, to listen better to their international students.
Yeah, that's the added value of the processional courses, isn't it, Claire? And that's why it's worth looking at what strategy use is developing, like what toolkit is developing there, because they are then expected when they join the actual course they are here for, they are expected to interact like that. And not everybody is aware that they may be focused on listening like the vocabulary and the grammar rather than listening to the content. And once the academic content is added, it's an extra layer, right? So EAP courses may be more about teaching you how to interact in an English environment, in an English speaking environment. But when you join your sociology course, then you start talking about a specific context with specific terminology and interactions. So are to,
but even just as absolutely simple as giving them the confidence to say to a lecturer in a seminar, I'm sorry, that phrase,
exactly,
I wasn't quite sure what you meant in that context.
Yes.
Could you explain it another way? Then they're getting the academic tutors to reframe their message, not just say it again quicker and louder, which can sometimes be what we do. So I think all of this is aiming to try and understand the listening and speaking experience of the students, but in a very inclusive way. This is in order to make sure that everybody in the seminar is able to take part as efficiently as possible. And often we find home students, international students, almost don't have that habit of listening and speaking to each other very well either. And so this is not just an L2 issue.
No, it definitely is not. Sometimes you found the native speakers, because they have language, doesn't mean what they said all makes sense, because they can talk a lot. And so for the other students, although they didn't speak, actually they think quite a lot here. But I think listening and speaking is an area students, particularly they come from different cultural backgrounds, they haven't been exposed to this kind of situation. So you need to ask them to talk. Of course, they focus on how they can speak accurately, making fewer mistakes. But then, cognitively, that takes a lot of time to process here. So once they process that, the turn is gone. They have no chance to speak that. So I think listening and speaking probably do need to raise academics or pre-sessional courses teachers' attention to how they could train them, because that is like the gateway to get them into the course. They need to have that as basic skills to get access to all the listening materials, lecture materials. Because I found, because I've been the director for a master's course for how many years? Look at the outscore, they can be very high. But when they come to the classroom, they say, what's going on? They couldn't function well enough. So probably that is also another thing we need to look at the pre-sessional, what kind of focus that they focus, how they can prepare the students to get them to these courses.
And I guess the onus has to be on the staff as well. I mean, if you think about the UK, the overwhelmingly monolingual white academic staff, who are kind of you know, dictating to the students what's correct and what's not correct, and is that the right way to say it, and using all these kind of, you know, informal ways of speaking and things, and just expecting people from all over the world to understand. That's also, you know, something that we all need to think about, I think, isn't it? We've got 1 minute until 4:30, so I think we better wrap it up. Thank you so much. It's been really interesting. I think it's so important for us, with more and more international students coming to this country, to, you know, be sort of keeping abreast of this research and thinking about, you know, what we know and how we can help. So a little thank you from Suzanne,
Oh, dear, great.
who was name checked in this
Yeah,
talk.
thank goodness for that.
So thanks everyone for coming. We've got, I was going to tell you when the next CeLM talk is, but we don't actually have a firm date, so I can't. But if you want to go back and watch this again, it will appear on our YouTube channel very soon. And thank you once again to our speakers and panelists, Anna, Claire and May.
Thank you for having us.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.